Our next speaker is a professor of sustainable design in Finland at the Aalto University. Please welcome Idil Gaziulusoy.
Thank you. How are you? I am very well. Thank you very much.
And we appreciate so much. You've been here from the beginning of the event, so you've heard all the discussions, so you can relate to them. And I'll leave the stage to you.
Thank you very much. It was actually a pleasure to be here from the very beginning of the event until now. And it's an honor to share the stage with very prominent, very smart people. So, let's start. Good, you're laughing. I got your attention, so I can talk a little bit about a divergent topic, but picking up on Joanda Akinola's emphasis on diversity today. And also, I did not, when I prepared this slide, prepared this presentation, I did not have this in my mind. But based on what I had experienced and heard in the past 2 days, I decided to use this slide not only to make you laugh, but also maybe give a little bit of a lecture on diversity. Joanda was first, of course, so I need to expand what she said. So the next time I create mankind, I'll conduct an environmental impact study first. Well, first of all, there's so much wrong in this slide, but first thing is the word mankind. So in an engineering society, it's still very, very common to refer to humans as mankind. Please, let's not do that. But also, let's move on from that to you know, we're not mankinds, we are humankinds, but also we're not men or women engineers, but we are human engineers. Let's honor the fact that this is Pride Week, and let's also move on from binary language. That was my little point about diversity. Yes, I do think that God shouldn't have created mankind, but luckily, we are kind humans, and I think we can only address the problems that we are facing today, and next generations will face even more strongly, by being kind humans. And we cannot rely on God to make us or the next generations kind humans, because as you see, He's unverified at best. So thank you very much for this little epilogue. Now let's move on to my, how does this work? Where should I point this to? I have no idea. Hello? Okay, great. So obviously the mysterious forces in the universe wanted you to be exposed to that slide a bit longer. But let's move on. So yes, I'm Assistant Professor of Sustainable Design at Aalto, but I'm going to start my presentation by telling you a little bit about my academic and geographic adventures. This is very relevant to why I'm doing what I'm doing today. So I was born and raised in Turkey, when it was a very different country than it's now. I have a bachelor degree in engineering. And although it was intriguing, I got a bit frustrated towards the end of my degree, because we were, at the time, as I understood engineering, we were developing technology. We were technology-driven, but we were not asking certain questions, fundamental questions about those technologies. And there was this course at 4th year, Ethics in Engineering. I was looking forward to it because I thought I could find some of the answers to the questions that I was having about technology. However, before I made it to the last year, they have closed that course. I got very frustrated. So I moved to a different department, a different discipline, where I thought would enable me to understand the human side of technology and human side of things a little bit. So I did my master's in industrial design, which is when I started to improve environmental and social performance of products through design. But By the end of that degree, I got frustrated again because I realized that whatever product I put out there as a designer, it would have an environmental and social impact. So I decided, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to design a single product ever. So I moved to New Zealand in order to understand what sustainability is and was a little bit more. And I went back into engineering faculty, but to one of the world's first sustainability science PhD programs. And that's when I actually was exposed to the ideas of transdisciplinary research and different types of knowledge, as mentioned by Professor Lee Jinghai today. It expanded my mind so much, but I realized there was an amazing opportunity to actually integrate my design background with sustainability science. And I kind of established, or my PhD was one of the first in the world, of an area, emerging area, that today we refer to as design for sustainability transitions. So what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my presentation is pretty much an explanation of what it is and what kind of projects I have used it. So I would like to see hands of those people who are familiar with this framework. Oh, not many. Okay. Thank you. So this is by Stockholm Resilience Center, known as the Planetary Boundaries Framework. This framework sets safe operating space for humanity, and beyond these safe thresholds, Earth systems functioning becomes disrupted, and we are, as humanity, facing increasing risks. At the moment, we have overshot 2 of these boundaries very severely. 2 of them severely, so these pose increasingly high risk. 2 of them not quantified yet, and 3 of them, only 3 of them, is within the safe space. So that set an understanding of the physical systems of Earth. But then, of course, there's a social dimension. Kate Raworth, an economist, inspired by Planetary Boundaries framework, developed a donut model. Some of you might be familiar with it. So anyone who is familiar with donut economics? Okay, more or less the same number. So Kate Raworth looked at what she called social foundations. She has demonstrated by empirical evidence that society is failing to meet any of those foundations sufficiently. That's about basically human needs. So when we talk about sustainability, we should talk about justice alongside. And we are currently facing a very urgent and quite radical need for change, or a big need for radical change, which we call sustainability transitions or sustainability transformations. So transitions are needed, some of them are already unfolding, and some of them will eventually unfold. Mobility transitions is a very good example of a transition, not necessarily a sustainability transition, but we have to make it a sustainability transition. So transitions are structural, systemic, and societal level transformations. They're large scale and they're very, very complex. And I have theorized, but also provided some exploratory initial evidence that although transitions are mostly framed as technological challenges, they're in fact design challenges. So what does that mean? They're design challenges of threefold. So first, we have to conceptualize entirely new systems that are supporting human society. And it's a creative design challenge. Then among these new system concepts, we need to be able to somehow evaluate which of those concepts are actually likely to help us reaching a sustainable society, and we need to develop and deploy them. So that's a technical design challenge. And last but not least, transitions are also political design challenges. So as Edgar Peters yesterday mentioned that you are engineers because you don't want to put your heads into this mess. Transitions are very messy. They're sociopolitically messy. There are a lot of vested interests. So in order to, also the stakeholders are predominantly the whole society, and actually more than human society. So in order to do these transitions, or achieve these transitions democratically, we need to design participatory processes so that the alternative futures that we come up with can be deliberated by more than us. We have, together with a colleague in Brunel University, looked at how design for sustainability area has evolved over time in the past 2 decades since it first started with green design. And we have found that it has actually mostly started with materials and components, and it was more palliative, it was reactionary, it was about improving what was wrong. But then the field has moved towards more systemic and longer-term approaches, looking at systems rather than individual artifacts or components. And we identified design for sustainability transitions as an emerging research and practice field, which subsumes all of the other approaches that we have identified along the evolution of design for sustainability. So design for sustainability transitions, sometimes transformations, is about transforming socio-technical ecological systems to achieve sustainability through design and innovation. And it's an integrative area. I wouldn't call that a discipline. I wouldn't classify it under a discipline. It integrates design research, future studies, and sustainability science and transitions theories. And it kind of resides at the intersection there. So moving on to transition theory a little bit, there are 3 types of activities in transitions. First is strategic activity. So this is about formation of long-term visions, of setting goals, of deciding where we want to go. And tactical activities are about implementing a change agenda. Then there are operational activities. These are small-scale, low-cost experiments for the potential systems that can replace the systems that we have today in order to understand their capacity and to learn from those experiments towards deployment of these systems in ways that's going to move us to sustainable society. Now, visions of alternative futures are very important. They're not only about dreaming, they're partly about dreaming, but they're also very much so feedback loops. So they give us an understanding of what the society understands as a desirable future. It tells us about what is seen as feasible today. It also tells us about not only feasibility, but also the symbolism behind imagery, behind these images, and helps us examining the assumptions that make our current reality. And it's really important, if we're going to transform the systems that we are operating within, we really need to start by destabilizing our assumptions about what is possible. And that's not only about engineering systems, it's also about our socio-political and socio-cultural systems, because the transitions, system transitions that we talk about cannot happen only within engineering systems. Changing a mobility system in the way that Dan was talking about requires significant lifestyle changes that are going to come about. So, I'd like to exemplify how design for sustainable transitions informed a project that I worked in before I moved to Aalto, to Finland, in Melbourne. So this was a project, multi-partner project, consortium project, funded by CRC, Low Carbon Living Cooperative Research Centres, which is the main funding body in Australia. We had partners from local governments as well as from international built environment consultancies. I was working in Victorian Eco-Innovation Lab in University of Melbourne as a sustainability scientist and a design researcher, and I was collaborating with 2 other researchers in 2 other universities. One of them was a climate policy expert, and he was an unorthodox economist, self-identified. And the other researcher was a futures inquiry methods expert. We followed a design-led methodology. So what does this mean? Our processes were participatory, and they were iterative. We did not really have a very clear set methodology from the outset. We have shaped our methodology as we moved through the project process and learned about what we were actually doing, and also based on the input of our stakeholders and partners, we have shaped the direction of the project. It was transdisciplinary. So it actually tapped into expertise from several different disciplines, but also non-academic experts. It had creative, analytical, and integrative components. It was a total of 3.5 years. So the first year was visions, second year was scenarios, and the final year was pathways year, and the beginning was the half year that we kicked off the project. This is a kind of simplified version of a very, very messy project process methodology, but as you can see, we had done lots of desktop research. We did visioning workshops, participatory visioning workshops in Australia and Sydney. And based on these workshops, we ran 1-week-long design charrettes with the professional designers that we have commissioned in the project. And we brought our research insights, and they brought their insights from the visioning process. And we created visualizations of the visions that people shared with us about desirable, sustainable, low-carbon futures. So these glimpses, as we call them, represent critical moments from the futures that were imagined in those visioning workshops. We took these visualizations back to our stakeholders, and we continued discussions about what is desirable, what is sustainable. We also interviewed a series of experts in order to feed into our process, and we developed a series of prototype scenarios. So I think initially we had 7, but finally we took 4 prototype scenarios to another participatory workshop to get them challenged, to get them expanded and detailed, so that eventually we had internally consistent but externally divergent scenarios of urban systems. So as you can see, the columns here represent different generic density, urban density levels, and the rows are different scenarios. These are exactly same location and existing location, by the way. And you can understand more or less. There's a lot of text behind this, but I'm not going to get into the detail. But you can look at the keywords. Yes, I am aware. You can look at the keywords, and you can understand what kind of futures each of these scenarios represent. So emission reductions are necessary, fundamental, and urgent if we are going to address climate change. And these scenarios actually can be located across the spectrum of efficiency increase and consumption reduction, which is basically the 2 conflicting positions about how can we do this. And you can see that 4 scenarios fall across the spectrum. Then these futures have actually different worldview and value bases, and also different governance models underlying them. And in each of them, there is a different power body that kind of governs the society. As you can see, the 2 scenarios on that side are egalitarian futures. On that side, they're meritocracy. But then the top 2 are top-down governance, whereas bottom-up or the bottom scenarios are decentralized. Finally, we looked at who are creating these futures now, because all of these futures actually exist at the moment, either in seeds or even in forms of kind of emerging innovations. And it's very important to understand the advocates of particular futures in order to be able to respond to and carry all of the stakeholders with us in steering these transitions. Now coming to the end of my presentation, I use this project in order to understand the roles design plays in these in transition processes. And what I have found was only 2 of the roles that designers played in this project were actually roles that were traditionally associated with design profession. On the other hand, the rest covers quite a lot of strategic and soft skills. A lot of it is to do with synthesis and synthesizing knowledge and also bearing uncertainty. This also relates to, I would like to link this to Ruth Graham's talk about engineering education. So we have identified a similar trend in design, and we're also now developing a new bachelor program in design in Aalto based on our findings of what actually will be needed from designers of the future. In the context of design, in the context of transitions, design is not about cars or salt and pepper shakers or chairs, but it really is about challenging us about our current reality, probing its limits, and making new realities possible. And we're still trying to understand a little bit more in depth, theoretically, what this area means. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.